Comma use. In this video, we're going to look at 17 comma use rules. Rule number 1. Use a comma before coordinating conjunctions that join two independent clauses. Let's look at this example. In this example, we have two independent clauses. The first, May will arrive at noon, comes before the coordinating conjunction but. This is an independent clause because we have a main verb, will arrive, and a subject, may. The second independent clause is she has to leave at 1:30 p.m. Has is the main verb, and she is the subject. So we have two independent clauses, subject verb plus subject verb joined by a coordinating conjunction. In that case, a comma is required after the first independent clause. Rule number 2. This is related to rule number 1. Do not use a comma if there is not a complete independent clause, both before and after the coordinating conjunction. So here we have an independent clause before the coordinating conjunction. Again, will arrive is the main verb, may is the subject. We have our coordinating conjunction but. However, after the coordinating conjunction, we have leave, which is a verb, but no subject. In this case, the entire sentence is one independent clause. We don't have two separate independent clauses. So really this whole sentence is one independent clause. Therefore, no comma is required before the coordinating conjunction. Rule number 3. Use a comma to separate a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence for the rest of the sentence. If a subordinate clause, which we know begins with a subordinate conjunction like if or because or since, there's many others, I'll say etc. here. If a subordinate clause opens the sentence and is followed by the main subject and verb, then we put a comma after the subordinate clause. Rule number 4. Usually no comma is required if the subordinate clause follows the independent clause. So in this sentence, it's a reverse of the sentence we just saw in rule number 3. Here, we have our subordinate conjunction. The subordinate clause is at the end of the sentence. It follows the subject and verb. In this case, no comma is required between the subject and verb and the subordinate clause that follows it. Rule number 5 is similar to rule number 3. Use a comma to separate a long introductory phrase or series of short prepositional phrases from the rest of the sentence. In this case, instead of a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence, we have a very complex prepositional phrase. When we have an introductory phrase at the beginning of the sentence coming before the subject and the verb, to make things extremely clear, include a comma after the introductory phrase. However, if the phrase is very short, for example, in the forest the dog ran, we don't need to include a comma after the introductory phrase in the forest, because no misreading is going to happen. The misreading here of this sentence would be unlikely. The introductory prepositional phrase is quite simple. However, rule number 6 relates to rule number 5. A comma is necessary even after a short phrase if the phrase is considered a transitional expression. Let's look at example number 1. In fact, I was ill all that day. Some transitional expressions, like in fact, are actually prepositional phrases. But one of our rules, as we will come to later on in this video, is that for transitional expressions are always separated from the rest of the sentence with commas. And in fact, just like however, or all in all, or in conclusion, are considered transitional expressions. Always put a comma after an introductory transitional expression. The second part of this rule number 6 is, if the sentence could be misread, include a comma after a short introductory phrase. Let's read this sentence. In the morning, sun streamed into the room. This is correct because we've included a comma to help us read this sentence. The comma separates morning and sun. It separates this opening prepositional phrase from the rest of the sentence. It separates the opening prepositional phrase from the subject and the verb. Main verb streamed, the subject is sun. Let's, for a minute, let's get rid of this comma, or imagine the comma is not there. And let's read the sentence. In the morning sun streamed into the room. The reader may make the mistake of thinking that the writer meant the morning sun. So to avoid any confusion, it's much easier simply to put a comma after the short introductory phrase. Rule number 7. Use a comma to separate all introductory verbal phrases from the rest of the sentence. A verbal phrase often consists of a verb followed by a prepositional phrase. So, very similar to rule number 5, if we have a complex opening phrase, in this case, a verbal phrase is considered fairly complex. Verbal phrase. It comes before the subject and verb. Flung in this sentence is the main verb. He is the subject. Separate them with a comma. Rule number 8. Use a comma to separate items in a list containing 3 or more items. Let's look at example number 1. Please ask Jim, Sally, and Sue to come to the office. What's important here is to realize that not only do we include a comma between item number 1 and item number 2, but we should include a comma before item number 2 and 3, even though we have a coordinating conjunction. Rule number 9. Use a comma or commas to separate transitional expressions from the rest of the sentence. Your course pack, by the way, has a list of transitional expressions. Transitional expressions help with the flow or cohesiveness of your writing, and they also link ideas in terms of expressing the logic between the two ideas. Example number 1, consequently, John was late for work. Was is our main verb, and the subject in this sentence is John. We have a word here, consequently, which is a transition. It helps indicate logic between this particular sentence and presumably a sentence that came before it. So be sure to include a comma to separate it from the rest of the sentence. In example number 2, Mary, on the other hand, did not complete the assignment. On the other hand is a transitional expression. Be sure, if the transitional expression is found in the middle of the sentence, to put commas on either side of it. Rule number 10. Use commas around words or word groups that interrupt the main flow of thought in a sentence and are not necessary to the central meaning of the sentence. These word groups are similar to transitional expressions. His report was, in my opinion, well organized. In my opinion is a prepositional phrase. It also can be considered a transitional expression. Either way, it is similar to what I called in parts of a sentence window dressing. It's really not all that important. It's certainly not that important to the structure of the sentence, but in this case it's actually not even that important to the meaning of the sentence. It's mostly there for style. Other expressions that interrupt the flow of a sentence are word groups like I think, in my opinion, to be sure. Again, very similar to transitional expressions. And when in doubt, separate transitional expressions from the rest of the sentence with commas. Rule number 11. Use commas to separate appositives from the rest of the sentence. Now, appositives are word groups that explain or give some additional information about other words in the sentence and do not begin with who, whom, which, or that. For example, Sue and Mary, my best friends, will both be at the party tonight. My best friends is an appositive. It helps describe words that came before it. In this case, very similar again to transitional expressions and similar to a rule we're going to see when it comes to the word which, a modifying word group that begins with the word which. Modifying word groups in the middle of the sentence should be separated from the rest of the sentence with commas. Rule number 12. Use commas to separate names of people addressed from the rest of the sentence. If you are addressing someone or speaking to someone, that person's name must be separated from the rest of the sentence with comma or commas. For example, John, when are you planning to submit your assignment? Similarly, if we said, when are you, comma, John, planning to submit your assignment, two commas are required, one on each side of John, because we must separate the person being addressed from the rest of the sentence. Rule 13. Use commas to separate each item of information in an address or date. However, do not use a comma to separate the month from the year when no day is used. For example, Mary used to live at 4456 Queen Street, Edmonton, Alberta. We have three parts to Mary's address. The first part is her street address, then the city, then the province. Each item must be separated with commas. This is a similar rule if applied to dates. So look at the second example. The last meeting was held on Tuesday, October 20th, 2006. The day of the week is one part of the date. The month and day is another part of the date, and the year is the third. Each item must be separated from the rest of the sentence with commas. And finally, Bob and Kelly were married in June 1987. If no date is included with the month, no comma is required. Rule number 14. If the address or date appears at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence, place a comma at the end of the last item. Paris, France is my favorite city. This is correct. Notice, if we didn't put a comma in after both the city and the province, confusion, in this case, with these words would result. Paris, France, is my favorite city. Here, this sentence, Paris, France is my favorite city, means we're speaking, presumably, to a person named Paris, and we're stating that France is a city, which would be incorrect. So confusion and misinterpretation could result. Similarly, in the second example, June 4th, 2009 was the day I finally graduated from college. Be sure not only to separate the date June 4th from the year with a comma, but make sure that after the year you place a comma to avoid any confusion. Rule number 15. Use commas around a descriptive phrase or clauses introduced by who, whom, whose, which, or that, if the phrase or clause is not necessary to the central meaning of the sentence. If the descriptive phrase or clause is necessary to the central meaning of the sentence, do not use commas. This is probably the most difficult of the comma rules because some judgment, it's not cut and dry, some judgment is required on the writer. Let's look at the first example. All students who do their assignments will pass the course. In this case, the writer is saying that who do their assignments is essential. It's a modifying word group that is essential to the meaning of the sentence. And because it is so essential, no commas are included around this modifying word group. In the second sentence, the writer is saying that this modifying word group, beginning with who, is non-essential to the central meaning of the sentence. John, who is sitting in the back row, is my cousin. For the writer, who is sitting in the back row could be eliminated from this sentence, and the central meaning of the sentence is still conveyed. In that case, commas are required around non-essential modifying word groups. Rule 16. Use a comma whenever its absence might cause the sentence to be misread. This was alluded to earlier. Let's read these two sentences. Inside, the boys were quietly playing a game of Monopoly. We use a comma after inside because if we didn't, we would probably force the reader to read the sentence again, because without that comma, the reader in sequential order of the words would start reading the sentence and read it as inside the boys, but really we're not talking about anything like food inside the boys or anything like that. We want to mention that inside, presumably a house, the boys are doing something like, in this case, playing a game of Monopoly. Similarly, in the second sentence, you can imagine the misinterpretation if the comma here didn't exist. The reader would read, as you know nothing, at the beginning of the sentence. And of course, that's not in the intent at all of the writer. As you know is a transitional expression. Similar to, say, I do believe. It's a stylistic transitional expression that opens the sentence, and we know that transitional expressions should have commas after them. So when in doubt, place a comma to help the reader properly read the sentence and its meaning. Rule number 17. Never separate a subject from its verb or a verb from its subject with only one comma. For example, this sentence is incorrect. The leaves of the little bushes at the back of my yard turn red in the fall. In this sentence, the writer has the subject as the leaves, and the verb is turn. Essentially, what he or she has done is separated the subject and the verb with one comma. If he or she wants to use a comma here because there's some sort of modifying word group after the subject leaves, then 2 commas are required around the modifying word group. For example, the leaves of the little bushes which I planted at the back of my yard turn red in the fall. Again, the subject here is leaves. Turn is the main verb. Which I planted at the back of my yard is a modifying word group that's not essential to the central meaning of the sentence. So in this case, the writer put commas around the entire modifying word group to separate this modifying word group from the rest of the sentence.